Good afternoon, everybody. As Selena said, my name's Chad. I'm the Chief Information Officer here at Aldridge. I've been in the IT industry for over 20 years, and I've helped hundreds of small businesses navigate the types of challenges we're going to be discussing today. As Chief Information Officer, my job here at Aldridge is really to guide the technologies that we at Aldridge use, but really also the technologies that we bring to the table to help you and your businesses. My team's focus is on understanding client organization goals and developing strategic plans for how IT contributes to and helps enable your own organization's success. With that, let's go ahead and get started. So let's talk about what we're going to cover today. We'll go into each of these topics over the course of the next hour. First of all, security is a big buzzword. What exactly does it mean? And we'll dive into some of that. We'll talk a bit about what security risks could mean to your business and a bit about what the threat landscape looks like today. Security isn't something that you achieve. It's really a process of ongoing attention and refinement. So how do you get started with it? How do you have conversations about security within your organization? We'll talk a bit about the top 5 security risks that we're seeing facing businesses today and how to help mitigate them. And really by the end of this hour, I'm hoping you can take away a few key things you can do this month to help economically improve your organization's own security posture. And we'll round out with some additional resources, some next steps, and hopefully we'll have some time for some Q&A. So security is about building a rational, informed culture to mitigate risks. After all, you have buildings, you have offices, you lock the doors of your building. It's inconvenient for you. It slows you down when you want to enter or exit your building, but it mitigates one level of risk at a relatively low cost. Keep in mind, from a security perspective, the good guys have to be vigilant and successful all the time. The bad guys only have to be successful once. Security is as much about responding to an incident that occurred and learning from it as it is trying to prevent the incidents the first time around. So to help us talk about security, let's talk about the types of risks we're trying to mitigate. So what are we really trying to protect against? Well, you've heard about many of the impacts in the news for some of the largest security incidents that have happened to even companies in the enterprise space. There's things like identity compromise, where a bad actor is able to take actions inside an organization with the stolen privileges of someone else legitimately within that organization. After all, if your system thinks it's you, the bad guy has all your rights, abilities, and permissions. There's business interruption. Systems can be brought down by compromise or damage. What's it take to get back up and running? How long can you operate in a diminished state? There's things like data loss. Beyond interruption, there could be intentionally damaged or deleted data. How do you recover from that? There's data compromise, someone taking your private information or the private information that you hold in trust and taking it outside your organization, possibly to the world. What harm could someone do with the right piece of privileged information? And finally, there's financial loss, direct theft, blackmail, extortion, operation interruptions, reputation damage, trust damage, mitigation costs, recovery. But when you get down to it, all of the risks ultimately represent potential losses of money. But a given security incident cost doesn't hit all at once. So let's think about that. Security breaches really have impacts over time. In the short term, you've got, honestly, the upfront shock at being the victim of a crime. There's honest frustration, probably a little bit of outrage. As an organization, have you prepared how you would respond? Who does what when? How do you start putting the pieces together? There's business interruption, there's data loss, there's system repairs and recovery. There's probably some confusion and inconvenience to you and your customers. Can you plan for that? You need to manage communications to people potentially affected by the security breach, which might include your customers, your vendors, and your associates. In the medium term, you have absorbing the losses and damages for all the things that resulted from the breach. You probably have increased costs to expedite implementing some of the additional security controls that you'd like to put in place to try to prevent it from happening again and things like it. You certainly have the ongoing uncertainty of the residual impacts or the data loss. Towards that end, some breaches have long-term impacts. There's impacts to your reputation, your organization's trust. The internet has a long memory. In some environments, there might even be regulatory impacts or investigation costs or even fines if certain types of privileged information were involved in the breach. But from all of this, you also still have lessons learned, and hopefully a lot of these things motivate cultural change to improve your organization's own security posture. So what's the threat landscape look like for small businesses today? And what are the key things that small businesses need to be prepared to deal with. Let me introduce 5 common threats, and later on we'll discuss what security is, and we'll revisit these to talk about ways you can start to mitigate these risks. So let's start with phishing. Everybody's seeing phishing these days, and that's phishing with a PH. As technology's gotten better, it's become harder for the bad guys to get into secured network systems and data. Technology is not the low-hanging fruit anymore, it's people. The first and last line of defense in security is always people. And phishing is the practice of using social engineering, exploiting people's trust and helpful nature to have privileged people innocently take insecure actions within your organization that only benefit the bad actor and at the bad actor's direction. Successful phishing attacks might compromise an individual user's credential, giving it to the outside bad guy and access to the individual's mail and remote access in your files. Or it might prompt your company to send thousands of dollars to someone who's attempting to steal it. Or it might be releasing private documents or information sets to someone you thought was a vendor or contractor, but is really trying to trick you into providing it so they can exploit it or impersonate your organization. Then there's credential compromise. If I can't brute force my way into your network, maybe I can trick you into giving me a key, or I can use your own bad habits against you. Keep in mind, once a bad actor has your credentials, if a username and password are all your key business systems require, the bad actor is you. They have all of your rights. Think about all the things you can do or touch in your business information each day, and think about what someone else could do with it. Credentials do get compromised in many ways, and phishing is one way, which we just talked about, where I send you an email that helpfully tells you your account's about to expire and takes you to my website where I ask you to provide your current username and password, and then automatically replies back that your account's been repaired. Congratulations. Well, at the same time, that website gives me your username and password that you just provided and what company network you contacted me from. Phishing can also happen over the phone. If I call a random person in your organization and say, "Hi, Jim, this is Bill in IT. About 30 minutes ago, your computer sent us a health warning that suggests there's a problem with its hard drive. Everything's probably okay, but I need to arrange a time to run a 5-minute diagnostic on your computer. Could we do that now? Okay, great. One moment and I'll get on the screen with you. Whoa, could you go to this website for me? And for security, I don't want to know your password. So when it prompts, if you could enter it, I'll get this done as quickly as I can for you." We've seen passwords leak out of organizations using things just like that. Now, keep in mind, passwords can be hard to remember. People often use the same passwords on multiple websites or services, and if one of those services gets compromised, bad actors on the internet likely now have your email address and a list of passwords you've used in the past. How about they try those passwords against the front door of your company's network? They know where you work from your company's email address. Would they get in? Would they get into anyone else's account within your company? Can you say the same level of password security and consciousness exists for all of your employees? Malware is another type of security threat out there. Malware is really just any software that you permit or that becomes able to run on one of your company's computer systems, but that you didn't intend to be there, and that does things that are actively harmful to you and your organization. And some malware used to just pop up advertisements or phone home to its author's network and transfer data. IT honestly got pretty good at detecting and blocking those types of software with everyday best practices and anti-malware software. This is a standard part of IT today. But then the malware authors started getting more creative, and they started using things like cryptography maliciously by encrypting files that the user that launched it can see, and then popping up a ransom note demanding money to unlock your files. All of these things tie into the types of software that people could inadvertently bring into your network or be tricked at launching with their own levels of permission. Your business today likely runs in large part on information, and that's sometimes information that's proprietary to you or your processes or your customers. It could even be privileged, regulated information about your customers or their transactions or their privacy. And sometimes someone is out to steal that information from you. Some of it has value, especially if the bad guys are specifically targeting you or your organization. I've seen cases that have suggested foreign competitors have knocked on network perimeters and information services, sometimes to try to deface a website or disrupt systems, but sometimes to take customer lists. I've also seen cases where malware was able to run designed specifically to scan and match lists of 16-digit numbers that look like credit card information, or 9-digit numbers that look like social security and identity information, and push those files out to a hidden spot on the internet to let the bad actor pick them up later. Do you have that type of information stored in your systems? What would one of those scans show in your environment? Information can also be innocently compromised. Have you ever addressed an email to the wrong person? What if you had a file containing privileged information attached to that email? Are people in your office able to use USB flash drives to copy files? Can they plug their phones into their computers and transfer files? Can they access their personal email in a web browser and send an email to themselves while attaching files from inside your organization? Now, these things aren't all inherently bad, but they do represent ways privileged information can walk out of your control, and they're important things to consider in your overall organization security. Rounding out our top 5, let's not forget internet-facing vulnerabilities. And really here, we're talking about controlling what network traffic can enter and leave your organization's office networks, the line between your systems and the general internet, and putting some controls around what traffic can and cannot contain. Now, many of your organizations might operate key lines of business applications on network servers you have to operate, either at your offices or in the cloud. And part of your business strategy is probably mobility and knowledge sharing to be able to work with these resources conveniently from wherever you are. But that also means at least the existence of those services can be seen by the bad guys running scanning software on the internet. If my bad scanning software knocks on the virtual front door of your office and something answers hello, it can report back to me that something's there. I can then use other software to probe what that is through automated question and answer tasks. And once I know what it is, maybe I can use the information it shares against a list of known exploits to compromise it and get into your network. We'll talk more about how to help secure your business against these and other threats a little further on. But first, let's talk about how to make security something you can actually make business decisions about. So let me start by explaining what security isn't. Security is not a goal. It's not a destination. It's not something you can achieve and say, whoop, there we go, we're done, we're secure. It's a process of ongoing attention and refinement. Organizations that are interested in improving their security start by taking a look at their security posture today. They recognize the costs and risks of their posture, and they decide what they reasonably want their security posture to look like tomorrow. And they start making those changes as an organization and maintaining and refining that stance as part of their organization's culture. It's really a top-down initiative. And towards that end, security is about mitigating risk, and that's about making decisions. When you become aware of a security risk, either proactively or kind of reactively, you can decide to do one of 4 things about it. You can accept the risk. And for many risks, this is reasonable. You're signing up to own the risk as part of normal business operations. We all do these. The potential exposure isn't significant enough to warrant major investment to eliminate it. As I said, that's fine, as long as you do it as an informed decision. And second, you could choose to avoid it, or at least try to avoid it. You could refuse to store certain types of customer information. You could stay out of certain lines of business or limit your geography. You could avoid engaging certain industries that themselves have high security or regulatory needs. And that's fine too. And you can recognize the cost and make an appropriate business decision about it. Third, you can choose to mitigate the risk. This really means you've accepted the risk and you're doing something about it. That sensitive customer information you don't want, well, you could have policies in place to immediately and safely dispose of information you don't want that might still inadvertently reach you. Do you have privileged information or proprietary information? Are you storing it encrypted? Is it protected in a place that has least privilege access so you can control who can get to it? And is its access and activity appropriately logged? Could you tell who got to it? Does your email system know how to recognize it and prevent it from being sent to outside recipients? And lastly, fourth option, you can transfer the risk and its ownership and its accountability to another party. If you use a credit card payment portal today and direct your customers to that portal to pay you, and you never see, nor need, nor require any details about your customers' credit card numbers, you're transferring the risk of safely storing that information to your portal company. You then back that up with policies in your own organization on what to do and what not to do should that privileged information actually enter your own control. So these are things you can do with risk, but how do you quantify risk? When businesses need to make decisions, they need something real to make a decision about. And there are various ways of assessing risk and putting tangible and intangible impacts to things. So at a high level, let's talk about how you can have that discussion in your own organization. First of all, let's make it real. Let's set the guideline for everybody participating that you have to understand the business impact of a given risk. Once you know the business impact of the risk, you can then help prioritize that risk. Because every risk has to be framed and represented as a business case upon which a business decision can actually be made. If you're not taking a risk-based approach to security, then you're really just reacting to the security issue of the day. This happened, I should do something about it. Not, this might happen, let's think about how we can help prevent that. Second, let's consider the quantitative impacts, the things that are tangible that you can count or calculate the cost of. For example, you could have downtime and business interruption. I'm sure you understand what the cost of operations are, and if you don't have any revenue for that day, but you still incur the cost, that's real. There's business retasking cost. What if you had to pull 3 of your best people off their regular work to deal with a security breach? What if they had to spend a week investigating that and fixing the damage? There's a real cost to that. You might have, depending on the industry that you're in, regulatory fines associated with the impact. You could also have a loss of forecast future income. It might be based on information assets that were compromised in the breach. Maybe you had some intellectual property that was your secret sauce in your business that suddenly is easily available or gets into the hands of some of your competitors. And last but not least, consider the qualitative impacts, the things you can't count or easily measure, but that you know are valuable to your organization. As an example, imagine that you've got a client-facing service XYZ that's got to be operational 24/7. You can't conduct business without it. And sure, if that's not available, there's downtime, and that downtime has that direct quantifiable cost. But what about the impacts to your customers' confidence in your services? What about the impacts to their downstream business if your service isn't available? What about the perceived trust in the quality and time value of your own service? Now, these things are all hard to quantify, but they're all important to consider within your teams as you consider how you're going to prioritize which risks to mitigate. And just keep up with my slides. So what's the right level of security? If you want to be in business tomorrow, you know your revenue has to exceed your costs. And similarly, the cost of security needs to be less than the comparative risk you've assessed. If you do this what if scenario, and you do this what if session with your team, and you think about what if this happened, you can sort that list into things you think are extraordinarily unlikely to happen versus things that, yeah, that could happen. For each of those things, using that assessment of risk that you've done, you've got an idea in round numbers, just estimates, about the potential impact of that risk. If you multiply the chance of something occurring by the estimated cost of that thing actually occurring, you've got a metric of comparative risk to consider. The comparative risk is the real weighted financial impact, and that's really what you want to prioritize. So something that could likely happen, as in, whoops, I sent that email to the wrong person, but that has a relatively low potential cost. Well, I'll give them a call and apologize, and I'll ask them to delete it. There's really no harm done. Might have a low comparative risk. It's probably not worth spending tens of thousands of dollars on more email education for your staff and advanced security systems that require you to confirm, are you sure, with every email you send, even though you acknowledge as an organization that yes, this could and likely does happen somewhat regularly in your organization. The comparative risk is still small. Conversely, a risk that's very unlikely to happen, but that would be financially devastating, would have a very high comparative risk. By prioritizing by comparative risk, you can actually make decisions about where to spend your organization resources to improve your security posture. The cost of security has to be lower than the comparative risk, or it doesn't make sense. As you've probably concluded by now, security touches on many topics, and that's personnel, procedures, but certainly also in your IT. With that in mind, here are 3 for consideration that frequently come up in security conversations. The first one's identity. Identity services help you and your authorized staff access your company's resources by proving you are who you say you are. Identity overall includes usernames and passwords, but today it also includes things like 2-factor or multi-factor authentication, secure password reset, account activity auditing, and suspicious pattern detection. A big part of identity in IT today is trying to reduce the number of separate usernames and passwords that we have to have, that you have to remember, that everyone in your organization has to maintain. Eventually, we're trying to get to the point where we have a trusted identity service that all of your services and all of your applications rely upon, such that we can very quickly change credentials or authenticate the pattern of behavior of a particular user account from a security standpoint. Second, backup and recovery systems often come into play. They're designed to protect your data and your operating state and both get you back to an operating state when needed, but also let you look back to prior protected points in time to help understand what was or what may have changed. If somebody intentionally deletes or corrupts data in your system, backup and recovery systems and business continuity systems greatly reduce the financial impact of that, provided that there's been some planning ahead of time to mitigate it. Third, monitoring and alerting systems put layers of appropriate administrative control around risks, such that logs can be reviewed after an event, or events can alert groups like Aldridge's Network Operations Center or NOC of suspicious activity to investigate and validate. It doesn't make sense to log everything all the time. It's too much information. The comparative risk is not that high in most environments, such that we need to have that level of scrutiny, but we can identify the most valuable assets, the highest levels of comparative risk, and see what appropriate logging can be wrapped around those to provide a little bit of an audit trail for it. Now that we've made the security conversation real, let's talk about how to take some action on it. Now, fortunately, there's a growing body of knowledge available that you can put to work. One of those resources that we're going to go through here is from the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and the abbreviation for that is NIST. 5 years ago, as a consortium of public and private experts, NIST set out to create a cybersecurity framework. And the NIST framework is not a plan of what to do to help secure your organization. It's a plan of how to have the conversation and take action upon it. And the NIST framework really has 5 key guidance areas. You identify your assets and your risks. You establish appropriate protections around them, again, proportional to comparative risk. You detect violations of those assets. You plan meaningful responses to those detected violations ahead of time. And you recover from those violations to further refine your security culture. While the framework's purpose for being is towards the protection of critical national infrastructure and federal agencies, its advice is applicable to most organizations and industries. Now let's talk a bit more about each of those areas. So let's start with identify. And at first glance, you might expect the NIST framework to tell you what your risks are. It doesn't. But it does guide you through an exercise, a series of topics and subtopics designed to make you pause and understand what your landscape actually looks like. And from that, you'll begin to see some of your risks surface. For example, towards identify, the framework includes recommendations for physical IT equipment inventory. What should be in your network? What is in your network? What's connected to your network? The software systems, the external systems, the security roles and responsibilities, an understanding of your organization's relationships in its own industry, an inventory of your security policies, an inventory of your regulatory requirements, a list of your supplier dependencies, and so on. Within each topic, the framework includes references to additional information, and at the deepest level of detail, it even contains specific expectations or evaluation criteria, again, mostly tailored to the federal industries that it's targeting. But most small and medium-sized businesses find that the high-level outline is enough to get started, and that detail is helpful to clarify or qualify areas of potentially higher risk. The protect stage of the NIST framework provides guidance about levels of security that can be implemented, technically, physically, through business process and so forth, towards mitigating identified risks in your environment. Some of the things we've already talked about include promoting changes in sensitive control processes and trust habits in your organization, or providing proactive guidance or training to help your staff avoid social engineering scams and phishing, or implementing identity and security policies to reduce the risk of password compromise, or even considering data loss prevention or DLP systems to recognize regulated or protected information in emails like credit card numbers or social security numbers or files that may be about to leave your organization. Most of us have alarm systems on our homes, and they help us know if there's an unexpected event at the perimeter. Not every event is real, but the system's job is to establish normal and alert and prompt investigation when we deviate from normal. In IT security and in the NIST framework, that's what detection is. It's baselines, it's alerting, it's logging, it's establishing responsibilities about who's watching and what did they do if something appears while they're watching. In your organizations, to economically manage risk, it might come down to two questions. What systems can immediately and automatically respond to suspicious behavior? And two, who's monitoring the protection? Now, keep in mind that the safest building doesn't have any windows or doors. It's extremely secure, but it's not very functional. Similarly, 100% detection is 100% expensive, and you follow the same comparative risk model to help prioritize and budget. This is all about managing risk, and the effort should be reasonable and proportional. The NIST framework continues into respond and recover, and what to do if there's a security incident, what will be done to recover from a predicted risk, or what can be done to recover from an unpredicted risk, commensurate with its assessed impacts, and how to incorporate that into a continuous improvement for the future. A security plan in your organization doesn't have to be a book. Most small businesses get by just fine with a 2 to 10 page security plan, but you want to cover some high level things in it, such as you want to describe the types of risks the plan is intended to address and whom to escalate to for exceptions. You'd want to identify who owns the plan within your organization and who executes on the plan if and when it's needed. You'd want to state how the plan is invoked, what needs to happen such that the plan goes into effect, and what to do even before the owner of the plan can review and provide additional specific guidance. You want to set expectations for whom the plan executor should notify and how. You want to summarize the additional people or vendors that are needed or the critical systems that are relevant to the plan. And you want to set expectations for next steps after the initial security event is remediated. Who reviews and refines based on what actually happened on the event? Who does the after action? Who defines the additional recovery or long-term management needed? Does the plan include pulling together the executive team to say we need to review this event because it was of this magnitude? So let's go back to those 5 threats that most organizations are facing today, and let's apply some of what we talked about. What could you consider doing to help mitigate some of the risks those threats might represent to you? Well, let's start with phishing, back to social engineering. Phishing most often comes in the form of email today. And many commercial email systems today can be configured to add a visible warning to email that's coming from outside your own organization. Other services like Microsoft's Advanced Threat Protection support tools to let you enumerate your VIPs in your organization, people with spending or significant discretionary authority, and apply extra scrutiny to messages that come from the outside but try to masquerade as from those individuals. You can put proactive policies in place, just personnel policies, which could be as straightforward as telling your staff, I promise to never tell you to transfer funds without us going through this control process. If I ever do otherwise, you are to talk to me, not just call me on my cell phone or talk to me in person for confirmation and explanation. If you can't reach me, stop. I will not push you to do otherwise. I will not be mad, and I will thank you for following this process. There's also subscription services available to help educate your staff. And some of those are like services like knowbefore.com, which we can help set up to conduct friendly phishing campaigns against your own company with reports on who was vulnerable to what and opportunities for further education. For credential compromise and identity management, if you're not already using multi-factor authentication for your most important systems, And in most organizations, that's email, that's your line of business applications, that's banking, that's privileged information access. See what's necessary to get it in place. Security is about proving you are who you say you are by making you either provide something that you know, like a password, or proving that you have something, like a trusted smartphone pre-configured for authentication, or using something that you are, like a fingerprint or a retina scan. Multi-factor today is frequently enter your username and password, and your smartphone then buzzes to require you to approve your login. If someone were to try to compromise your password or to log in as you, your smartphone is going to unexpectedly buzz and ask you to approve or reject the login. If it was unexpected, you reject it. That's not me. And then we help investigate and remediate that. You can help people understand that for systems that they do just rely on a password, complex passwords that are forced to be changed relatively frequently are still a must. It's just the reality until all systems support better methods of security. Now, that usually means that organizations have to keep track of lists of passwords for vendors or suppliers. It could mean that everybody in your organization or certain roles have to keep track of 5, 15, 20 passwords for various vendor accounts. Whenever possible, those credentials should all be individual specific so that an individual credential can be deactivated if someone leaves or if it's compromised. But you may also want to consider password vaulting services like Ocular or LastPass. Malware is falling today, even as social engineers rising, and that's really just because technology is overall keeping pace with malware. It's always just a little bit behind in the escalation, but it's a high level of protection and it's not the biggest target today. But that's, again, because there's fairly effective automated countermeasures and there's well-adopted best practices in most organizations to minimize its impact. Be sure that you're running current generation computer equipment for your staff with current generation software with well-maintained security patching and updates. I mean, that system running Windows 7 will stop receiving security updates in January 2020. We've had a lot more success in security with organizations that have gone wholesale to Windows 10 and have kept that current. You want to adopt a policy that work only happens on work computers, whether at the office, at home, or on the road. Don't permit people to log into organization resources from the computer that the kids use. Now, I'm guessing here, but chances are the kids likely didn't consider the NIST framework in their own computer activities. You want to think about how business information must be kept and maintained in business managed and protected locations. Locations that have appropriate business decided authentication, security, backup, recovery, continuity, encryption. All of us know somebody who saves files to their desktop. All of us know somebody who's probably carrying a laptop around with those critical files saved to the desktop. As a business, you don't have good authentication or control of that content, especially if that laptop were to be stolen. You want to adopt enforceable policies, personnel policies that prohibit storage of business information on alternate media or services, at least for the things that are most critical, that have the highest comparative risk. But keep in mind your IT should be flexible to your team's needs while discouraging quote unquote shadow IT. Keep in mind today, it's easy for somebody in your organization without asking to just slap down a credit card and sign up for the latest and greatest new web service because it's cool. It's going to solve the need of the moment. But as an owner or a manager, think about what data of the organization is going to land in that service. How are logins to that service going to be managed? What are the controls for privileged information management and removal? You have to be aware that your business information can flow very easily into these types of services and proactively have those conversations in your own organization to help prevent it or at least make people aware of the risks. So how can you help keep your privileged information under control? Well, number one, easy, local drive encryption. In many regulated industries, theft of a computer or a laptop with appropriate encrypted storage, it's still a financial equipment lost. It's still the inconvenience of it having stolen. You've got to go through replacement, but it's not considered a reportable breach event because the local storage is encrypted. Local encryption features are built into most modern phones and operating systems. It's important as an organization that you turn those on for any piece of equipment that could have a high-risk piece of information on it. You want to establish policies about where sensitive information is permitted to be stored and put security controls around it to limit that access or monitor the access for the most sensitive data. You want to consider using data loss prevention or DLP features of your email or file sharing services to detect and block and alert when sensitive information may be leaving or about to leave your organization. The current generation DLP software out there can even pop up while you go to send an email saying, it looks like this email fits within this policy and is under this tighter level of control. Maybe it gives you the option to still send the email, but you have to provide a business reason that gets logged in the audit trail about why you're doing it. Maybe it was accidental and it gives you the opportunity to say, no, I didn't mean to send this. Lastly, you want to ensure that everyone in your organization is aware of the organization's intended posture and the controls and the responsibility about key types of information that you may have. Make those enforceable policies and part of your regular internal training, both when someone new comes on board, but occasionally just revisit it throughout the year and make sure that it's part of your culture. Back to the basics, be sure that you also secure the edges of your network. These are the boundaries between trusted and untrusted sections of your network, or between your trusted internal network and the general internet out there. You always want to use a current generation firewall with current and well-maintained threat management at the edge of the network, between your offices and the internet. You want to use commercial-grade wireless network equipment with appropriate security protocols and individual person authenticated access and internet-only restricted guest access, if you even choose to provide it at all. Keep in mind, it's very easy for someone to go to the store, buy a wireless access point right off the shelf, retail, consumer grade, plug it into a jack in your network, and you may not even know that it's there, but it's broadcasting an internal path directly into your wired network from all the adjacent floors of your building. You want to subscribe to penetration testing and vulnerability scanning. There are firms out there that will test your network firewall from the internet to see what it's revealing to the outside world and what vulnerabilities are known about it. And that will then also test your internal servers and your resources. There have been exploits out there that have taken over computer software built into network printers, even copiers, network printers, to run attacks and monitoring inside your network. Those devices run software. If those devices themselves aren't current and secure, they can be used as attack vectors for additional things and intrusions in your network. So let's keep things current and let's test to validate. So all that is to say, we've run through a lot of content in the session, and I hope you saw in the invitation that we'll be following up with some helpful links and resources as you consider security within your own organization. We'll also recap questions from the session and share the answers back with everyone, but let me take a breath here and I'll pause and I'll see what the top questions are that we can answer as a group in our remaining time. Selena?
Thank you, Chad. You covered a lot of great information today. I just want to let everyone know that if you're interested in learning more about the NIST framework, you can download our Get Started with the NIST Framework guide under the handouts drop-down in your GoToWebinar panel. Now let's address some of the questions we have waiting. Okay, the first question, what about employees that bring and use their own laptops to the office? Is there something we can do there?
So as an organization, you'd want to determine what level of access to what types of protected information those employees might have. Bring your own device is actually fairly common in a lot of organizations, but as an HR policy, as a hiring policy, you want to make sure that those employees are signing, agreeing, or acknowledging to something that by bringing their own equipment into the organization is taking some responsibility for control, management, and security of their devices. You don't want an employee that brings in their laptop from home that they also let the kids use working on your internal company network. You want to make sure that that employee understands you can bring your own device, but you will have these monitoring agents installed on it. You will follow at least these protocols for security. You will encrypt it. You will follow and use our business systems for all storage of information. And that's just a condition of employment. We encourage you bringing your own device. We think it's kind of fun that people can bring in what they like to bring in. But by doing so, they also have to give a little bit of trust to the organization so that the organization can trust their device.
Great. Another one, with everything moving to the cloud, how much of this is their responsibility versus ours in regards to security?
Cloud providers generally have a responsibility to make their service available to you and to give you the tools to administer the server. Cloud services are one way that you can transfer some of the risks of storage and encryption and backup and recovery to another party. But in general, cloud providers don't look into the data that's stored inside those systems. That's still your responsibility. And it's usually still your responsibility to manage who has access to the data within those systems. So while that can vary by the type of cloud service that you have, it's still important that you as an organization recognize that we have privileged information stored within this system, and you have appropriate controls around controlling access to that system and responding if there's a suspicion that data has gotten out of that system. The cloud provider can probably help you with some recovery methods. They could probably help you with backup and restore, but a lot of customers or a lot of organizations also go one step further and supplement their cloud services with additional layers of cloud backup by other services, just so that they're in a better recovery posture if they needed to. Bottom line, the information that you store in those systems is generally your responsibility, but you can still work with your cloud providers to understand what levels of responsibility for security that cloud provider is willing to take on.
Great, thanks, Chad. Let's take a few more questions. So what can we do to protect data from internal employees that may want to do something malicious, like steal a client list or anything else that could be a threat to the organization?
That's a hard one, mostly because a lot of that information people have to have in their everyday work to just do their jobs. So if you wanted to put a higher level of security around that, if that was the most critical information or the highest level of comparative risk, you'd really want to look at your software to say, well, how easy is it to export or run a report of everybody on the list? And while that may be necessary for people to do their jobs, you could also then establish a level of auditing or logging around that, depending on where that information is stored. If that information was just stored in files, like an Excel spreadsheet saved in SharePoint, for example, maybe your master customer list has a different level of security and staff can't get to it, but managers can, so it's not easy to copy the whole file. But if you can't do that, because that would interfere with people's ability to work, then about the best thing you can do there is put controls around it such that you can look for unusual patterns of behavior, either proactively by maybe there's a management report that shows, hey, this person's run this report 5 times in the last week. That's unusual. They've never run that before. Or in a worst case scenario, you can at least trace the steps afterwards and have a reasonable chance of making a case. Now, usually that's going to be a legal effort against someone to go through and say you accessed this information 2 days before you left. But those are the types of things that you can decide in a security posture.
Awesome. So what about in regards to an IT budget? What if we don't have a large budget, but we want to do 1 or 2 things that are inexpensive? What are those?
The easiest things to do that are inexpensive would be to start with multi-factor authentication and adding that into a service like Microsoft Office 365 or SharePoint Online or OneDrive for your file services. If your critical information is stored in a cloud-based platform like that, it becomes much more economical to secure than running your own large infrastructure. Multi-factor authentication and things like Microsoft Office 365, it's about an $8 a month per person add-on, which is really not that much considering you'd probably spend at least that much time just thinking about the potential problems that it could have. Now, granted, you've probably also got some additional systems, either on-premise infrastructure or servers or software that you're running. And the least expensive thing to do for that is make sure you've got good backup and continuity processes in place. Once you have those foundations in place, good multi-factor authentication for access to things like email and your cloud-based files, and you've got good backup and continuity for your on-premise infrastructure, you can then move up and start thinking about, okay, now that we've got at least some level of recoverability and control around this, what's the next risk? What's the next thing that we need to invest in?
Thanks, Chad. So what about vendors? With vendors and contractors that businesses give access to, what can they do to prevent risk and how can they best protect themselves?
So that varies by the type of access that you need to give those vendors or contractors. I had a situation recently where an organization was using contractors And those contractors were members inside the organization's own email system. And the contractor was not following appropriate security policies or got successfully phished. That contractor's credential was compromised, and they were able to act as the bad guy was able to act as the contractor within the firm's email for a while. So it's really about putting boundaries around what those vendors or those contractors really need to do in order to fulfill their roles and responsibilities with your organization. If they need email access, for example, make sure that they're following the same email best practices that everybody else is, maybe even to a tighter level of control. If they need access to critical files or systems, is there a place where those files could be stored that are separate and accessible to both your organization and the vendor or contractor, but a compromise only goes to those files that can't extend beyond that? Do you have processes in place when you begin or end a vendor or contractor relationship to make sure that they have their own defined level of security that gets set up and it gets appropriately revoked at the end? And at the most extreme, I've seen cases where people have configured mutual islands where the vendor or contractor can only access the island and certain staff within your organization can access the island, and the island is used for all information interchange such that the vendor or the contractor has no way to access the rest of your systems.
Great. So we have one last question here. What about information stored on iPhones? Is there anything you can do to protect that?
From an HR standpoint, information stored on iPhones should be subject to the same sort of bring your own device policy that other equipment is. People need to understand that if they're going to be checking their company email on their personal iPhone, then the company needs to have the ability and the right to wipe that iPhone remotely. If that person were to leave, or more commonly, if they were to lose or have their iPhone stolen, the company needs the ability to wipe the information off that phone. And the people that are bringing their own phones need to understand that that means you could lose all of the photos and other things that you have on your personal device, but you're personally accepting that risk and responsibility for the privilege of bringing your own device of your own choice and using it with company email. In some organizations, they've taken it a step further and they've subscribed to mobile device management software, things like Microsoft Intune or similar packages where you can sandbox the corporate information on the phone, require encryption within the sandbox, prevent information from even being copied and pasted from inside the sandbox to other areas of the phone. Like, say you had your corporate email running in the sandbox, the corporate email is accessible, but you can't even copy and paste from a corporate email to a personal email, for example, and then give the company the ability to wipe just the sandbox if they want to be polite about it. Now, there's cost associated with that, so that really goes back to the comparative risk conversation about where's the money going to be best spent. Most organizations don't go that far as a small business. It usually just makes more sense to have people agree that if they're going to check their business email on their mobile device, they agree that the company can wipe that mobile device and that they may lose personal information as a result.
We actually do have one more question, Chad. So should companies be using tools such as LastPass as a company-wide solution for part of their internal security measures?
It certainly makes sense to do so if your organization has to interact with a lot of outside vendors or services online where you have to keep track of all of these individual credentials, or as an organization, you have to keep track of logins and credentials. Those subscriptions to things like LastPass are not very expensive, and they provide that important level of control to say who has accessed which credentials when. And they give you a common place to store and manage those such that you can change the password. Nobody has to keep it in mind. No one has to write it down somewhere. The password vault becomes the only place by policy that the organization permits itself to store that type of secure information, so it can provide auditing, logging, and control around who has access to it.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone. It looks like we're out of time. So we're always looking to provide valuable information. And so if you have any ideas, please send them to webinars@aldridge.com, and we will do our best to create some content around them. That being said, I think we're ready to close the webinar. Thank you guys for joining.